Well, we're going to call it close enough and go ahead and get started. Have some visitors with us from Oklahoma. We're glad to have you here, my old stomping grounds. I got an email yesterday from our friends in Kyiv, Ukraine. First time I'd heard from them in about 10 days. It's really, if you've seen the news at all, you know it's getting very intense over there. And it's winter, and Putin has made a concerted effort to knock out all of the power in the country, and is doing a pretty good job of that. And so it's very sporadic that they have electricity or cell service or heat or water or any of the things that we take for granted. I mean, this is a picture that I got yesterday. This is their worship service a week ago. And, of course, they have ambient light coming in. And it's just inspiring to know the work that our brothers and sisters are doing in Kyiv, both in sharing the gospel and in bringing souls to Christ, and also in using the funds that are coming to them through Sunset International Bible Institute to buy food and medical supplies and clothing, especially for children, but for others as well. And they're traveling in a very antiquated van all over Ukraine, delivering supplies and sometimes coming home on a wing and a prayer with parts falling off of the van, but they continue to do it. The lady that is my main correspondent, Natasha, her husband is Sasha. As I told you once before, they live on the 20th floor of a 25-story apartment building, and in her latest communication, she said she timed it. It takes her 6 minutes to climb those stairs to get to her very cold apartment building. It's just a very, very, very unfortunate and unnecessary situation in Ukraine. We're getting closer and closer now to moving into the Sermon on the Mount. And I always dread that because Jesus sets the stakes so high, and we fall so far short of that. But, of course, one of the key teachings of that is forgiveness. And, man, I struggle with that, with people like Putin. Just so unconscionable. All right, so that's that. Let's get into our text. We're going to go through a fair amount of text fairly quickly this morning. Last week, you remember, we were talking about the paraplegic that was healed by Jesus at the pool just on the north side of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The man who hadn't been able to walk for 36 or 38 years, whatever it was. And the takeaway from that, among other things, was the absurd response of the scribes and the Pharisees and the religious leaders there when they saw the miracle and immediately jumped all over the man for picking up his mat on the Sabbath day. Well, that's going to continue now for two other events in our chronological look at the life of Christ. And so we're going to read through those fairly quickly. Then we'll look at that demonstrated through the chosen clip. And then we'll unpack that some more this morning. So that's kind of where we're headed. So this is from the 6th chapter of Luke. On another Sabbath day, a man with a deformed right hand. Luke's the only one. This is mentioned in all three of the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Luke's the only one that identifies which hand it was. He's the doctor. The others were not quite that specific, but he particularly points out that was the right hand. It was in the synagogue while Jesus was teaching. The teachers of the religious law and the Pharisees watched closely to see whether Jesus would heal the man on the Sabbath, because they were eager to find some legal charge to bring against him. He said to them, "If any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a man than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." I'm not violating the law of Moses. It is lawful to do that. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked these religious leaders, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or do evil, to save life or to kill?" And this is probably the smartest thing they did. They kept their mouth shut. They remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. So we're coming into the phase in Jesus' public ministry now where the Pharisees are no longer being sensitive at all about their intent. They are upset with him, they are angry with him, and the only solution they see to get rid of him is to simply kill him. And I think it's interesting that whatever their opinion was of Herod and all of that Herod stood for, they were perfectly willing to join hands with Herod as long as he would assist them in achieving their purpose. Go ahead, Mike.
This has never hit me.
We need the floor, Mike, please.
Test. 1, 2.
Do you need to know which one it is?
It's 19, stage 1.
Stage 1.
Test.
There we go.
There we go.
Thank you.
This has never hit me before, but you just read that where Jesus said to save a life or to kill. And then they go out and immediately on the Sabbath, how are we going to kill this man? I just find that ironic.
Well, just about everything they did in relationship to Jesus was pretty much ironic, and certainly clear picture of where their hearts were. At about that time, Jesus was walking through some grain fields on the Sabbath. So now we have the paraplegic in Jerusalem healed on the Sabbath. Now we've got the man with a withered hand. I'm not sure exactly where it was. I think some people have suggested that it might have been in Capernaum. Doesn't matter. And now we have the third one here. At about that time, Jesus was walking through some grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, so they began breaking off heads of wheat and eating the grain. Several laws broken here. They were violating the law against harvesting on the Sabbath because they were pulling the heads of grain off. They were violating the law against thrashing because they were getting rid of the husks so they could eat the wheat. They were violating the law against preparing a meal on the Sabbath. You couldn't do that. You had to prepare everything on Friday that you might want to eat on Saturday. So here's 3 laws immediately that they're breaking by eating that wheat there as they're traveling along. It was okay to eat the grain that they didn't own. That was not against the law, so long as they didn't use a sickle or they didn't take any of it home. So it was not theft that they were eating somebody else's food, according to the law. Again, this isn't the law of Moses. This is the Talmud. This is the oral law. But as long as they didn't take a sickle to it, they just used their hands, and they didn't put any in their pocket and carry it home with them, they weren't violating the law in that regard. Some Pharisees saw them do it and protested, "Your disciples shouldn't be doing that. It's against the law to work by harvesting grain on the Sabbath." Jesus said to them, "Haven't you ever read in the scripture what King David did when he and his companions were hungry?" And he's quoting now or referring back to 1 Samuel chapter 21. He said, "He went into the house of God, and they ate the special bread reserved for the priests alone." That was breaking the law too, wasn't it? And if you remember that account, David had asked Ahimelech for 5 loaves because he was on a sacred mission, and the rabbis have justified that because he was, quote, saving a life. There's a clause about saving a life and eating the sacred food from the temple. So they do have workarounds. It turns out that they have a lot of workarounds, but it's only to suit their purpose when it's helpful to them. "And haven't you ever read in the law of Moses that the priests on duty in the temple may work on the Sabbath? I tell you, there is one here who is even greater than the temple." And if you want to make a bunch of Pharisees mad, you've just done it. When he looked them in the eyes and said, "There is one here," speaking about himself, "there is one here who is even greater than the temple," that can say only one thing to these religious leaders. He's presenting himself as divine, because only God is greater than the temple in the mind of these Pharisees. The temple is as sacred as you can get on this earth. So if they were not already at the top of their range of anger with him, this certainly would have pushed them over. "But you would not have condemned my innocent disciples." I like that he justified his disciples. "If you knew the meaning of the scripture, I want you to show mercy, not offer sacrifices." And here he's quoting from Hosea chapter 6 and verse 6. "Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made to benefit people, and not people to benefit the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And I, the Son of Man, am master even of the Sabbath." We've talked about Son of Man several times. Son of Man is a remiz. It has a whole history behind it, which clearly is a statement that he is, in fact, the Messiah. And so he's quoting that to them and claiming to be the master even of the Sabbath. So he has done multiple things in succession that would push every button that these religious Pharisees, scribes and rabbis held sacred. So now we're going to watch the little clip as it's demonstrated in the Chosen, and then we'll unpack some of it some more. All right. So last week we kind of closed out with this picture, and you'll remember that this is a Shabbat candle, a Shabbat lamp. I'm sorry. It's actually an electric light, but you can't light a fire on the Sabbath if you're an Orthodox Jew, even today. And since the act of flipping a switch, an electric switch, creates an arc, a spark, a light, you can't use a switch to turn on a light on the Sabbath. So with this lamp, you turn it on Friday. And then when you get ready to go to bed, if it's too bright, you take hold of the top of that and you turn it, and then that turns and shields the light. That is not work. That's okay. Got it? That's the kind of law that the Jews created. And we've gone through some of this before, but I just wanted to remind you of it in case maybe you weren't in some of these classes, because it just really highlights how radical the law had become in Jesus' day. And truth be told, if you are an Orthodox Jew today, these laws still apply to you. And there is an attempt to try to observe them. Of course, it's an imperfect attempt because, Jesus said, you bind rules on people that they can't bear and you can't bear them yourself. It's not possible to keep them. So what we have is the Tanakh, which we call the Old Testament. It's actually in the Hebrew only 24 books. Ours is 29, as you know. But they combine some of them and rearrange some of them. And the word Tanakh is actually an acrostic. It's the first letters of the words that say Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, and the writings and the prophets. And those are the 3 big divisions of the Old Testament, and they call that the Tanakh. Now, within the Tanakh, of course, within the Old Testament, within the Torah, you have the Decalogue, you have the 10 Commandments, and you have the 600 and, what did we say, 613, is that correct? I can't remember now, something like that. Laws that were given through Moses to enforce the 10 Commandments. The Talmud is a combination of 2 sets of works. One is the Mishnah and the other is the Gemara. And the Mishnah is all of the oral laws that codify the Tanakh, the Old Testament. These were maintained as oral laws actually until about 200 AD, I should say around 70 AD is when it began. Because with the destruction of the temple and the dispersion of the Jewish people, it became necessary for them to put it into writing as much as they could. So the oral law is the teachings of the rabbis about the laws of the Torah. It's a huge volume of work. It's broken into 6 different orders. And each order has several different tractates in it. But they require obedience in matters of seeds, which of course is planting and harvesting, all of the festivals, how you observe them, when you observe them, what you have to do at the festival. Ladies, you wouldn't believe the oral laws that they wrote for you. Everything about you, your most personal things about you, are all codified. Torts, how you deal with business, legal activities, sacred things, the offering of sacrifices and so forth, and purity, all of the ceremonial washings and things that they did. So that's a huge volume of work. Many books to make up the Mishnah. Then you get to the Gemara. And the Gemara is the rabbinical analysis of the Mishnah. It's a commentary on and debate about all of these things that are in the Mishnah. And it makes the missioner look small. It is a huge volume of work. I think I told you, I just pulled out a section, one of the tractates concerning the laws on working on the Sabbath. And your head will just be spinning when you get through it. Well, we kind of look at that as being fairly foolish, I hope. I know Jesus did. But what about us? I'm going to talk about that for a little bit, and I'm going to be on my soapbox, and maybe the week before Christmas is not the best time to do that, but that's just where it happened to come up in our class progression. And I don't want to be offensive, but I'm going to be honest with my own beliefs and my own understandings. And I want to clearly distinguish between what Jesus did, as is recorded in Matthew 16, when he told his disciples, looking out over that pagan city of Caesarea Philippi, I am going to call out my sacred community, and hell will not be able to stand against it. What I'm talking about today is not that sacred community. What I'm talking about is the church. The church is an organizational entity created by men, for men, that I believe has accomplished great good and has created not so good. And I'm going to be focusing on our own tribe, what we have denominated as the Church of Christ. Now, as I go through this, you might be going to be thinking, wow, if that's what you think about our teachings, why don't you go somewhere else? Maybe you wish I would. We're no different than anybody else. We're not worse, we're not better. So it's not a matter of not loving the Church of Christ because I do. This is my family. As you all know, I was Church of Christ before I was born. Have been every day of my life. But in my own personal understanding, I have to distinguish between the Church of Christ, which has roots in human origin, and the sacred community that Jesus called into existence. So as I talk about this and as I offend you this morning, at least understand where I'm coming from, all right? So the law of Jesus as codified by the Church of Christ. And we have set in our organization the standard of creating law based on command, example, necessary inference, and silence of the Scripture. A command is something where there is a direct statement, thou shalt. And we assume that all commands are binding, unless they're not, which sometimes suits us. Examples are very ambiguous, and we can interpret them in many different lights. And we have collectively selected interpretations of certain examples and very happily and joyfully ignored others. Necessary inference is a way of saying that if we have a command, then this may be necessary to obey that command. So it's okay. So we have a command to sing. Well, we need to know the words that we're going to sing, right? So by necessary inference, it's okay for us to have books. We don't have an example of anybody having books, but it's okay because singing requires that. Silence in the Scripture is very, very convenient and handy because we can either decide that silence is permissive or prohibitive, depending on how it best accommodates our conclusion. And we have done a really good job of that in several areas. Some of the things that have been laws for us in my growing up, and not all of these pertain to all Church of Christ, because the Church of Christ is, as you know, divided among many, many different sects. One is that we should have no name but Church of Christ. My father was an elder in Stigler, Oklahoma, and I love my father and I respect him, and he was a really, really good man. But he and another elder came very close to firing a preacher because the preacher had the audacity to stand up in the pulpit and say that Jesus left the church unnamed. If we were to go out today and edit our sign on Bay Area Boulevard and take out the name Church of Christ, then we would immediately be out of fellowship with all of the other churches of Christ in our demographic area, right? That's a law. Didn't come from Jesus. Observe the Lord's Supper every Sunday and only on Sunday. Now, this is primarily based on the law of example, right? Because you see, Jesus ordained the Lord's Supper on Sunday morning. Therefore, it's a law that we should keep. Oh, wait a minute. Did I get that wrong? Maybe it was Thursday evening or Wednesday evening, depending on when you think the Last Supper occurred. It seems like there may have been some examples of people observing it daily in Acts 2. I'm not sure. But examples are nice, you see, because we can pick and choose, and it makes it very convenient. All who are eligible must drink communion from one cup. Now, fortunately, not all of these apply to Southeast. This is one that we don't observe, but it's a law, isn't it? And you know people who hold this as a test of faith and fellowship, right? The example that is used to prove this command, of course, are the words of Jesus at the Last Supper when he said, "All of you drink of it." There's a lot of confusion about whether he meant all of you drink from this one cup that I'm holding or whether all of you drink from the cup that is in front of you, because they each had the cup in front of them. But that's beside the point. Sometimes these congregations, for some reason, become large or larger, and it's hard to get one cup big enough for all of them. So you can have 2 1 cups, and that's okay. And I heard about a place, I wasn't there, but some of my friends were, when a group of teenagers were traveling on Sunday, and they came in as a group, and they didn't know it was a 1 cup church, and they ended up there. And when it came time for communion, well, they got about 2/3 of the way through, and the cup ran out. So you'd think they'd go back and fill the cup up and go again. Not so. You have to start over because everybody has to drink from the same cup. Refrain from all musical instruments, solos, and ensembles. In some places I've been, that means pitch pipes. I've even heard one lady complain that the use of a microphone, electronic amplification, would be the same as an instrument. That would be a breaking of the law. And this is a sacred cow for so many. And it is a law that determines fellowship, and the law that determines whether or not you can go to heaven. What did Jesus say about using instrumental music Sunday morning? Again, a law that relies on the silence of the Scripture primarily, as to whether or not it's required or allowed. No separate Bible classes. There's still some of those around. I'm not sure. I've never really looked at that close enough to know what the basis of that law is. I guess the absence of example, maybe. I don't know. I'm not sure. Do you know?
I think they think it maybe forsakes the assembly.
Forsaking the assembly, and if you're not all in the same, it could be it. You may be right. But it's a law, and they want fellowship people who have Bible classes. No eating in the church building. That's a pretty easy one, though, because you have a church building here. And of course, this is based on Paul's statement, what have you not homes to eat in? They forget the fact that he was writing to a group of people who were meeting in a home. But that's beside the point. But what you do, you've got your church building here, and there's no kitchen in there, and there's no way you can eat in there. So you have a lot big enough so you go about 20 feet to the right, and you build another little room, and that's your kitchen. And that's okay, but not in the building. I don't see this as much anymore, but for growing up, the idea of having any kind of an icon, even a cross, on a building was completely forbidden. When I was over in Nederland, over here, a couple of hours east of here, we had kind of an upgrade to our building at one time, and we changed out the light fixtures. And some of our ladies selected the light fixtures that they liked, and we put those in. And after it was all in and done, somebody looked up there, and if you looked at it at the right angle in the framework of that light, you can make out a cross. And there was serious consideration about taking them down. Now, obviously, we have crosses on our building here, but that's not the case in many, many of the churches of Christ. All women must remain silent in the church building between 10 a.m. and 12 a.m. except to sing. That's the law, and that will send you to hell quicker than anything if you violate that one. Women must have no visible role in Sunday morning worship or in church management. What did Jesus say about women being silent on Sunday morning?
I have a question for you.
I'm not going to debate these, but yes. What's your question?
My serious question is, one of the things you're asking is, what did Jesus specifically say? There's a lot of things Jesus didn't specifically say, but in almost all the books that Paul wrote, he puts down what sounds to me like edicts.
Almost all, thank you for bringing that up. Almost all of our sacred laws are based on Paul's writings.
Yeah.
And nobody who wrote in the New Testament had more to say against law than Paul did. Paul went to great lengths to help these new little struggling sacred communities made up of a combination of slaves and free and men and women and pagans and Jewish leaders find some commonality. And we have taken those very specific things and picked and chosen what we want to codify. And what we didn't want to codify, we conveniently ignored. And in no place is that more apparent than 1 Corinthians 14, which applies to the only thing that Paul ever said about women in the public assembly. He had some other things to say about women in man-woman, husband-wife relationship. And I think he was talking about husbands and wife, 1 Corinthians 14, in the context of it. Because the solution is go ask your husband. Most women who have a husband are married. Again, it's not my intent really to debate these because they've been debated ad infinitum. But can you see when we look at the Jewish laws, the Pharisees, the scribes, can you see how we have turned around and done the same thing? The true Church of Christ must not appear to fellowship with any denomination or false religion, which is everybody other than us. One of the saddest things that I've had to experience is when we brought Family Promise online, and I've talked about this before. When we were bringing Family Promise online, I was a part of that first group that started that here in this community. Served on the board for many years. Part of our task, our initial task, was to find 13 churches that would network together to make it happen. That's core. I talked to the the Pearland Church of Christ. I talked to Leak City. I talked to a church in Alvin. I called them and asked to speak to somebody who I could talk to. They said, are the other denominations going to be a part of this? Yes, of course they are. Don't even come talk to us. Do not come talk to us. We have no interest. And they didn't, and they don't, and they won't. That's a bad law. If you have ever been divorced, you cannot worship here. We've got people at Southeast right now who went to other churches in our area, and the first question they asked them on their second visit was, have you ever been divorced? And if they said yes, they said, we suggest you go find someplace else. Congregations cannot cooperate in supporting various institutions like orphanages and colleges. My brother was instrumental in beginning that movement. He's totally embedded in it. They took that doctrine of anti-institutionalism and went all over the Spanish-speaking world and divided little old churches that never promoted and never were able to support themselves, much less an orphanage. But you've got to think like I think, or you can't be my brother. And he split those churches, and he hurt some really good people. And I've apologized to some of them on his behalf because he won't. Codifying law. No congregation should have a located preacher. That's probably a pretty good law. No, I'm kidding. There are 5 and only 5 acts of worship, and they happen between 10 and 12 on Sunday morning only. There are 5 and only 5 steps to obeying the gospel, whatever that means. And while I stated law, all who come to our assembly who do not look like and think like us should be encouraged to find some other place where they would be more comfortable. We would never admit that. We would never admit that. But our Sunday morning gatherings look like that.
I would say that, not to debate these, calling any of these laws codified, I agree, wrong. I think there are lots of good principles buried in here that need to be within our thoughts.
Really good thought. And there is not anything in here that is of itself wrong until we bind it and make it a test of fellowship. Now, one thing that, and I'm out of time, as an organization, as a Church of Christ organization, and I love the Church of Christ and I love Southeast. This is the church I've looked for my whole life. I've said that many times and I mean it. You are my family. But as an organization, we are in competition, just like every organization is. And the way that we survive as an organization is to be relevant and to be inclusive and to not allow these laws to keep us from becoming whatever is next in our community. To maintain the status quo is to die in any organization. Look at Sears Roebuck. Look at Unical. I can name 100. To maintain the status quo is to die, and it applies to churches as well. And if we allow these rules to dictate what we can and cannot do in order to maintain our Father's church, then we are going to be in a world of hurt. And we can see it around us everywhere. Empty church buildings. Empty church buildings. Yes, sir.
But we cannot let our culture dictate what we will become either. But we have to, follow the principles of God. We have to be set apart. We have to be different.
We have to be different, but we have to be relevant. And we can't be different because we have created an arbitrary law that we use as a test of circumstances. Have a wonderful, God bless week.